Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Yeah? So thank you all very, very much for coming this evening to this talk on intercultural competence and leadership. And I very much appreciate the invitation to come to the business school. I'm very excited to be here. This is my third time to NMMU. I've only been to 2 cities in the entire continent. I've been to each of them 3 times now. And that would be Port Elizabeth and Cape Town. So I'm delighted to be back here in Port Elizabeth and to be here at the business school. I am based at Duke University in North Carolina, where the weather is not nearly as good as it is here right now. It's incredibly hot and humid in North Carolina. I don't know if anyone has ever experienced summer on the east coast of the U.S. It's not a very pleasant experience. So this feels very refreshing. It's just wonderful to be here, not only in the business school, but also to enjoy your wonderful winter. So thank you again very much. So today, I want to spend a bit of time talking with you about this topic. And in particular, we're going to have this be a bit interactive. I'm not going to lecture at you straight through, but I'm going to pause at certain points to ask you to engage with your neighbor. I think that's a really important piece as we learn from each other as well. And then we'll come back, just a few minutes, then come back together. And then at the end, there will be time for more Q&A. So if you're not sitting near a neighbor, hopefully you can turn around or find someone very shortly. We're going to start off with a little bit of discussion and then go through 3 myths around this topic, share with you two theories around a new leadership paradigm that involves intercultural competence. Then we'll go into looking at some foundations for leadership, there. And then looking at the framework, as you heard mentioned already, and then conclude with thinking about what does all this mean to you in your context. And so as we go through our time together, I want you to always have that in the back of your mind. What does this mean to me in my context, in the areas in which I'm going to be working or currently working? So that's where we're headed in our time together. So I want to start off with a quote from someone who also sojourned to South Africa many years ago. And this is a quote from Mahatma Gandhi. And he talked about leadership. And he said that at one point, leadership meant muscles. But today, it means getting along with people. And that is very true now as it was when he made that statement. And so I wanted to start with that as a way of thinking about and framing our thoughts on leadership. And what does it mean to get along with others, particularly those who are very diverse, who might look different than we do, especially those who believe differently, and those we might not always agree with. And so it's important to think about what does that mean to get along together. So over to you. 2 quick questions for you. If you will turn to your neighbor and just for a couple minutes, very briefly, and then I'll bring us back together. What is leadership from your perspective? And what is global leadership? This is a way for those students in the room to bring in some of your coursework together. And then what kind of leadership is needed in a diverse workplace? I was very impressed with the quote from Professor Burgess here. And he talks about the importance of being able to have the skills to manage across diverse contexts, including cultural contexts. So what does that look like? What exactly does that mean? So take just a couple minutes, turn to your neighbor, and discuss these 2 questions. Then we'll come back together. Great, thanks very much for discussing these 2 questions with each other. I'm particularly interested in your thoughts on the second one. What do you think about what kind of leadership is needed in a diverse workplace? What were some of your responses to that question?
I think in terms of the fundamentals of communication is firstly to listen and to understand. I think that if leadership has to just practice that and get away from the busyness of business, but to understand and engage with people, that is where the authenticity and all these other elements starts becoming or starts building on the fundamentals of both good communication skills.
So it starts with the listening piece, and then that leads to the understanding and authenticity. Thank you very much. Yes.
We also elaborated on good communication and also leading by example, to be a role model, and especially I think in a diverse workplace, you as a leader will also learn as you progress and grow, and to kind of have a transparency and a collaboration and a participation of all people, embracing their differences and taking advantage of those qualities that make them different and using it to your advantage.
Absolutely. So a really key piece that you said was learning. The leader learns along the way and continues to learn and doesn't have all the answers and models that for others. Yeah, thank you very much. Anyone on this side want to share something that you were discussing? Or you could volunteer a neighbor. Someone's sort of being volunteered. No? What about over here?
Possibly you could have your leader as someone who's centered, who's not going to, they're going to provide basically a rock, where they're not going to be pulled all over the place, where the people around them will know what that person, how their feelings, their reactions, what they will be. Because very often I think people may try and bend towards one side and then suddenly get pulled back, where you've got diverse cultures and that within your organization. Rather you need somebody who is solid, they're centered upon themselves, that the people know when they're dealing with that person, this is what they will get.
Okay, so someone who's centered, who's grounded, who has perhaps a strong sense of self, is not easily swayed. Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing your thoughts with each other just now, and then with some of you who shared with the rest of us as well. Thank you very much. So, as we continue to think about that, there are some myths related to intercultural competence, and I invite you to also think about other myths that you have encountered in your experiences. First of all, the intercultural competence is like leadership. You either have it or you don't. And both of those are myths, right? Unfortunately, that is a myth that is out there. Whereas actually, if we all naturally had intercultural competence, the world would probably be in a lot better place, because we'd probably all be getting along a lot better with each other than what we are. But both of these are something that needs to be intentionally addressed. That's why you're here at a business school, that we need to intentionally address both intercultural competence and leadership. It's not something that just occurs naturally for us, or for many of us. There's a myth that someone with international experience has intercultural competence, and that international experience equals intercultural competence. And I'm sure you've seen those who come to South Africa from other places, maybe not exhibiting intercultural competence here in the South African context, yes? And maybe you know of colleagues who've gone other places who've really struggled. And doesn't mean that just someone with international experience knows the world and is magically ready to go in between all the different cultures. So that's an important myth to recognize and say, no, we need to recognize it's more than that. A third myth is that it's only for leaders who work across national borders. And as you just heard from the beautiful introduction, thank you very much, that intercultural competence is for everyone who works basically with humans, because we're not all identical. Thank goodness. It would be a really boring place if we were all the same. But there's such diversity here in Port Elizabeth, here within South Africa. There's so much difference within one's country, within one's society. So it's not about just those who are crossing borders or working across borders. The borders are here too. And so it's important to recognize that this is for everyone, for all of us. So, what about leadership in the 21st century? I would love to engage in more conversation to hear more about what you've learned on this and what your thoughts are. I want to share with you two pieces that are kind of shifting the paradigm around leadership in the 21st century. I'm curious, how many of you are familiar with Lip and Blumen's work on connective leadership? Anyone? She is based in the US. And how many of you are familiar with Kostas' work on attuned leadership? He's a visiting professor at Rhodes, was formerly at Stellenbosch Business School, and also was a chancellor of a university here in South Africa. So have you encountered his book in any of your coursework? Yeah? Okay. So just to briefly share with you, connective leadership proposes kind of a new way of thinking about leadership. It's about promoting alliances, so not looking at the competition as you see down here, but looking more for collaborators, which is very different in the business world. Thinking about collaborators and who can we enter into alliances with. Looking for that common ground is really important. That there's going to be ambiguity, and we just need to embrace that, particularly in our ever-changing world with all of its differences. And I understand even within the South African context, things are constantly changing, and so learning how to embrace that is really important. Understanding that interdependence that comes from being interconnected. The willingness to share power, which I loved your comment about servant leadership, and looking at more as service and sharing that power of really being able to embrace these multiple visions, not saying this is my vision, everybody needs to embrace my vision, but saying, no, what about the multiple visions that can exist? And what can we do with that, including being able to see this shades of gray piece. And so there are 4 key questions in connective leadership that come out, asking who are our collaborators currently, or who can we collaborate with in the future? How can we support each other, and what's needed as we support each other? And think about this in your context. And then this is an interesting question that connective leadership asks. What are our dreams? What are our dreams? And how will we reach our dreams together? How will we reach our dreams together? So connective leadership invites us into these 4 questions. And Lippenblumen wrote a book. If you're interested in learning more, we won't go into great detail right now. But I just wanted to kind of share this with you as a changing paradigm, a new paradigm of thinking about leadership in the 21st century. In the same way, attuned leadership from COSA uses the underlying principle of Ubuntu. And he talks about being really attuned. And some of you already made comments around that, to really being able to be authentic, to understand others, understand what their needs are, so that in the end we can better serve them through our work and business. And so attuned leadership really focuses on emphasizing mutual relationships. What does it mean, thinking about in your context, what does it mean to be having a mutual relationship between leader and follower, for example? What does that look like? Being inclusive, and some of you made comments about that as well, and then really focusing on that interconnectedness. So then it's very similar in some ways to what Lippenblumen was talking about, looking at the interconnectedness. COSA goes on to talk about how we need to not just think about it, but combine it with action. And in the end, and I love this part, he talks about it's integrating compassion, empathy, humility, integrity, which kind of that center founding rock that you talked about, and effectiveness. How can we emphasize all of this in business? How can corporations emphasize this? I want you to really think about that. How can government even, how can business, corporations integrate these different elements? So that's a bit about some new ways of thinking about leadership than perhaps is in the traditional literature. Some foundations for leadership as we move forward. A lot of the literature might talk about a global mindset. We'll talk more about that in just a moment. Adaptability, which impacts the degrees of success. Business that doesn't adapt fails. That adaptability is really important. And then intercultural competence. And that impacts, as you've already talked about, how we communicate. Our ability to communicate and influence in diverse settings. So we're going to talk about each of these, the first 2 briefly, and then I'll spend more time on the third one, because that's the area of my research and work. So there are different ways to think about a global mindset. A lot's been written. I would love to hear your thoughts about what you've learned around a global mindset. This is some of what emerges from the literature, that it's an awareness of diverse contexts, being very aware of that it's important that involve holistic thinking, holistically, and even beyond national contexts. So holistically, and that we kind of back to the 2 pieces I shared with you from COSA and Lippenblumen, that's an interconnected view, that we're able to see the interconnections where others may not. And that's a really important part of leadership, is that leaders can see those interconnections. And so, asking yourself, reflecting, how well do you see interconnections? How well can you do that? Adaptability is really the ability to change over, to stay up with the change, to be a cultural chameleon, if you will, and ultimately to have that empathy that Kosa talked about. So that adaptability is really key, not only for entities, corporations, but also as individuals. How can we adapt to those we're working with? And finally, we get to intercultural competence. And so now it's your turn again. I would like for you to turn back to your neighbors and discuss with each other, what is this? What have you learned about it? What are your thoughts on it? What's your experience with it? What is intercultural competence? Take just a few minutes to discuss with each other. All right, thank you very much for discussing this with each other. Obviously, this is a question that we can discuss for a long time. So I would love to just hear briefly, though, from you. What were some of your thoughts or experiences with intercultural competence? What is it?
It is gaining a sensitivity as a competence within context of a diverse setting of interaction. Acknowledging differences, but the emphasis is on sensitive interaction.
So with an emphasis on interaction, it's that sensitivity to difference.
Correct.
Great, thank you. Excellent. Other thoughts on intercultural competence? What is it?
It's not my words, I read it and I recently used it in a class context, but it was said that if you are humble, polite and friendly, you can go anywhere in the world. And I thought it was so true. Because humbleness means that you don't think you're better than another culture. In terms of polite, it means you've got respect for the person of another culture. And then just having a friendly disposition means you're open to hear what they want to say.
Okay, so a friendly disposition implying openness, and the politeness implying respect, and then the being humble. Yeah, that's a really interesting and really good way to look at it. In fact, that's actually kind of the cutting edge of where this research is headed, because the term that's now coming out of some of the research is cultural humility. So it's not so much about intercultural competence as it may be about cultural humility, which is often defined as two elements. One is the respect piece that you mentioned, and the second is cultural self-awareness of understanding one's limitations. Kind of like we talked about how the leader doesn't have all the answers, and the leader understanding, I don't have all the answers, I don't know everything. And so that cultural humility in how we approach others is really coming out in the research as being very key. So thank you for bringing that up. Any other thoughts? Yes?
It's not my area, but as I'm thinking, does anybody ever consider the culture of the organization in terms of your competence of being able to fit into the organizational culture, regardless of who you are?
Absolutely. That's a really key piece as well. Looking at the culture of an organization. In the case of higher education institutions, they will often have a culture about each separate institution. And even for those, how many of you teach? Yeah. Even teachers, your classroom kind of develops its own microculture where your students know what you mean and know what you expect. And so even in that situation, it becomes more of a microculture. Yeah. Thanks very much for discussing this. So this is a question that I posed to a group of experts. And I used a research methodology called the Delphi methodology. I don't know if anyone is familiar with that. It's often used to predict trends. So, yeah. Or to reach consensus, in which case here I needed them to reach consensus, hopefully, on what is intercultural competence. What are the key elements? And so I'd like to talk with you through that. Many of you probably know that a basic definition of competence are knowledge, skills, and attitudes. KSAs, ASKs, however you want to call that, that's a basic definition. So according to the research I've done with leading intercultural experts, they were able to identify some key attitudes, key knowledge areas, and key skill areas, which lead to internal and external outcomes, which I'll talk about in just a minute. So I'll just talk you through this, and then the model itself, the framework, I have a link here, and a few more slides later on. And so you can find it online, and there's also been quite a bit written about it as well. But let me just talk you through some of these. So some of what you've already said, 3 key attitudes that are absolutely essential for interculturally competent leaders, for interculturally competent people. This is for anyone. Respect is really important. Understanding that how we show respect varies by culture. So we need to understand how that is shown can really vary. Even something as basic as eye contact. Maybe in this culture, in my culture, that's acceptable. In other cultures, that would be a sign of disrespect. And so we need to understand those parts of how we show respect. But we say the bottom line here is, how do we show we truly value the other as a fellow human? How do we show we truly value the other as a fellow human? We may not agree with everything they say, we may not agree with what they believe. That can be the hard part then, to show that we still value them, regardless of those disagreements. The openness, being open-minded, and then finally being curious, of wanting to learn. Help me understand. Help me understand why it's done this way here. Of really being curious. These are 3 very key fundamental attitudes to the development of intercultural competence. Knowledge areas, and this is kind of summarized from the research, cultural self-awareness was really important. And there's an analogy that I like to use with cultural self-awareness, and why this is so fundamental. Actually, it's one of the starting points for intercultural competence. And it's a bit of a story. Imagine that there are 2 groups of people. And when they're born with sunglasses. Just the way it is. These are the blue sunglass people. And they really like to get to know these other people better. And so they come over and say, how do you know, it's really cool. You guys are born with sunglasses too, just like us. Then you think, wait a minute, there's something a little bit different. So let me try on your sunglasses. And the blue sunglass people put those other sunglasses on. Well, these were the yellow sunglass people. So what color do the blue sunglass people see? They see green. Exactly. They're seeing the world through their own cultural lens. All of us see the world through our own culturally conditioned lens. From the experiences that we grew up with, the cultural groups to which we belong, we're seeing that. So as much as I really want to understand the South African context and the diversity here, I'm still going to be interpreting it through my own U.S. American culturally conditioned lens. I can try hard, but I need to start with understanding what is that lens through which I'm seeing the world. So that cultural self-awareness becomes really, really important. And then you go through and you see a lot more about the deeper understandings, going beneath the, how many of you are familiar with the iceberg concept of culture? Kind of the tip of the iceberg are the things we see about a culture, right? Music, movies, clothes, food, the fun stuff. But if we really are serious about getting to know people better and really understanding them, we need to go much deeper. We need to understand the deeper cultural values that impact behavior. And so that's where that comes in. And so, asking yourselves, to what extent do your experiences, do your courses address those deeper pieces beneath the tip of the iceberg? And then we get to skills. And these skills, if you look at them, are not very specific to crossing culture, to working with persons who are different. And I love it that listening came out earlier in our discussion. Right there, look at that. Listening is so fundamental as a skill. Observing is so fundamental. In fact, I had an opportunity to talk with a manager at a Fortune 500 company. He traveled all around the world working with lots of different employees. And I had to ask my assistant, what's your secret? What have you learned from all of this experience of working with so many diverse employees and so many different contexts around the world? He said 2 things. I said, what are those? He said, I learned the importance of listening, and I learned the importance of observing. And those 2 skills have gotten me further than anything else. Listening and observing. So that's a really key piece. So then we have the knowledge, skills, and attitudes. Okay, so what does that lead to? Ideally, that leads to an internal outcome. What happens within an individual? That an individual becomes more adaptable. We talked about adaptability earlier. More flexible. We'll have developed empathy. Empathy. And there's one particular way of thinking about empathy from the intercultural perspective. Many religions and many cultures around the world have something. In my culture, it's called the Golden Rule. In South Africa, it's called Golden Rule?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. So what is the Golden Rule? Do unto others as you would have done unto you. Guess what? That does not work cross-culturally. That is not intercultural competence. Because not everyone in the world wants to be treated like a white, middle-aged, middle-class, U.S. American woman like me. So if I go around treating everyone the way I want to be treated, I am going to make mistakes. That is for sure. So what works instead, and this is thinking about empathy, is the platinum rule. And what's the platinum rule? Do unto others as they want done unto them. We cannot assume how people want to be treated. We need to be careful about making those assumptions. But that's a really, really big challenge, because that means I need to understand how each one of you wants to be treated. I can't make assumptions that I know. But then that becomes empathy. So that's a really important piece. And again, some of the emerging research is really looking at this empathy piece as huge. And you saw it come out in the 2 leadership paradigms I shared with you earlier. So putting it all together, what is intercultural competence? You can see it's quite complex. If you had to give a really brief definition, this is it. This is the external outcome. This is what we experience in the workplace and in our daily lives. It is behavior, and someone mentioned behavior earlier, and communication, which also came up earlier. Behavior and communication that is both effective and appropriate. And those 2 words are really important. A lot of business literature talks about effectiveness. That is only half of the picture. Because there can be leaders and others who can be very effective in what they do and totally inappropriate in how they go about doing it. To have intercultural competence, we must be both effective and appropriate. And who judges appropriateness? Only the other. It can only, if you ask me, I can say, yes, I was appropriate in South Africa. But if they ask you, you might say, no, Darla violated every cultural norm we know. Hopefully you won't, but it really is up to you to decide whether I'm appropriate or not. Not for me to determine that. So the 2 models can be found. I know this is a very long website, but I think you'll be sent this link afterwards so you can access the models, because this is very hard to see. This is what you can access later. This is the process model, this is really demonstrating, there are 2 versions, but this is demonstrating that this is a lifelong process. We are all on a lifelong journey in developing intercultural competence, and that there's no point at which any of us can say, yes, I'm there. But it's about constantly learning throughout life, throughout the different contexts we encounter. So just briefly, looking at this from others' perspectives, because there was only one element that these experts agreed on 100% as being absolutely essential to intercultural competence, and that was to see from others' perspectives. So my burning question is, what are other perspectives on this? Because one of the limitations of what I just shared with you is that it is a largely US-centric model of intercultural competence, very much focused on the individual and the knowledge and skills and attitudes of the individual. When we start looking in other contexts, we start seeing something a little different. I just spent the month of June in China working with colleagues there on this concept. And there is much more about relationship. Interestingly, authenticity came out in China as being very important as well, that authenticity. In India, it's looking at the oneness within diversity. Latin America is very broad. It's hard to generalize there, but two pieces that emerge have to do with generosity and the importance of context, meaning history, the historical context, the economic and social context. And interestingly enough, from some of the scholars doing work here in South Africa, the concept of Ubuntu really comes out as being an important part of intercultural competence. I'd be curious as to your thoughts on that, and understanding more about this concept from a South African perspective. So, kind of to wrap this up, how do we develop this? I want to share with you briefly 6 stages of developing intercultural competence. How many of you are familiar with Bennett's developmental model of intercultural sensitivity? Okay, so if you're familiar with it, this will be a refresher, or I can just turn it over to you and you can help me explain. Okay, so according to Bennett, the first stage is basically ignorance, denying that there's any difference that exists anywhere in the world. Hopefully none of us are at that point. The second stage is defense. And that is anytime when we say one culture is better than another. And it can go either way. We can say, yes, my culture is best, and all the others not as good. And I understand from the Development 2030 report that might be some of the case that's coming through in other regions in Southern Africa, that the perception is that South Africa thinks of itself as having arrived. So you have to kind of look at what are those stages. Also, this is a stage where any of you studied abroad in other places? Yeah? So study abroad students will sometimes come back, and they might say, for example, if a U.S. student comes back and says, oh, South Africa's fabulous. U.S., whoa, we've got it so bad here now. It's not good at all. That's actually still this stage. They think that's a very sophisticated way of looking at the world. They're still saying one culture is better than another. Then we get to minimization. And that's, if you've ever encountered colleagues who say, you know what, why are we so focused on difference? Let's just focus on similarity. Differences divide us. Have you ever had colleagues say this to you? That is this stage, where we try to minimize difference and say, no, let's just look at what we have in common. That's where, perhaps in religion, you say, oh, we're all God's children. Or if a teacher in a school might say, I don't see color, I'm colorblind. That's this stage. But that is still a somewhat ethnocentric stage. Why? Because we're saying that I'm seeing everyone like me. I'm saying that everyone we're looking for similarities, that my similarities. So then that's only the third stage. There are 3 more that we tend to then shift to actually beginning to look at difference. And the next stage is acceptance. To say, yeah, I accept that there's difference. There are differences. They are real. They exist. We need to discuss them. We need to talk about them. We need to address them. And we need to eventually learn to adapt. That's more the action stage. How do we adapt to those differences? This is a really important stage, especially for business and corporation. Attention to differences and learn to adapt to those, not to ignore them. Eventually, the last stage, according to Bennett, is integration. And he says there that individuals who've reached this stage can kind of flow in and out of cultures, almost similar to the way you might put on and off hats or something. Often these are individuals who have been raised, let's say by parents from 2 different cultures, maybe they lived in multiple other cultures. Terms like global nomad, maybe some of you are global nomads, or third culture kids, TCKs. But this is actually a really tough place to be. You know why? Because every place is home, but no place is home. And oftentimes persons in this stage might say, home is where my family is. It's not a geographic location. So this is interesting to kind of look at, according to Bennett, some of the stages of development. And if you want to read more, there are other resources about that. Kind of in concluding then, some of the in terms of developing global leaders, it is important to be very intentional, to look at how can we continue to develop our global mindsets, to really focus on relationships. And the two paradigms I shared with you from Costa and Lipton Blumen really talk about the importance of relationships. And that's really key to look at. of being able to see from others' perspectives, understanding the interconnectedness, and then really continuing to work on our own intercultural competence, reflecting deeply on how we can continue to develop our own intercultural competence as we work with others. So, I know we're right at about our time. These are some questions for you to think about. This is your homework, if you will. To think about what insights or takeaways do you have from our time together this evening. And I want you to think about how you can translate that into action steps. What are you going to do differently? What will you do now in terms of intercultural competence development for yourself or for others you work with? I want to conclude with a quote from Barack Obama. He made this quote in a domestic context in the United States. He was speaking at a graduation. And in that speech, he talked about kind of the much bigger picture of why it's so important that we focus on intercultural competence. He said, our very survival has never required greater cooperation and understanding among all people from all places than at this moment in history that we're living in right now. That when we open our hearts and minds to those who may not think like we do or believe what we do, that's when we discover at least the possibility of common ground. I want to wish you all the very best in your many endeavors as you go into the world and continue to work to help make this world a better place. Thank you very much for having me here this evening.